Phil, mass moves mass, bro, doesn't it?
Always.
Now,
Well, not linearly, but like
there he is. He couldn't just give a
no.
hang on, I've got to caveat this scientifically. That's why you're here, Phil. I'll make the silly Jim Bro claims, and you can come in. Well, actually, yes, mass does move mass in some circumstances, and whilst that is a wonderful excuse to get a really strong bench, whilst also eating all pints of Ben & Jerry's within sight, which is something I have trialed in the past and led to me benching 160 kilos for 2, I am now more aware of the drawbacks of pursuing mass at all costs, because when balancing strength and endurance, you are trying to utilize your mass to move mass in a weight setting, but you are also moving your mass over certain distances or terrains, and that is where there is a balance to be found. So this podcast discussion came out of the back of a conversation we were having yesterday, where we were talking about the sort of demand and load of moving as a heavier athlete, and where certain people feel more athletically, I guess, well-rounded at certain body weights, and how if you completely over-index on endurance training and sacrifice all of your strength work in the pursuit of being lighter, then you're probably not trying to balance opposing disciplines as much, and therefore don't have as much transient impact load going through your running, which can make the running easier. Whereas if you are a heavier athlete with strength-dominant metrics, and you're including running, and you're trying to improve there is an additional load cumulatively to be considered. So I think the way we should approach this, Phil, is we'll talk about why mass moves mass, which I guess is probably easiest done in a strength training setting. And then we'll talk about the things that people should be aware of applied to an endurance setting, because there's some practical things, there's some physiological things, and then there's some sort of leverage and biomechanical related things, which I think are worth flagging as well, because part of the reason that mass can move mass in a bench press setting is because your back and pecs literally get thicker, so the bar needs to travel less distance. So there's a lot of downstream mass moving mass elements that I think I'd like to flag, because I've been a big proponent of mass moving mass ever since I first picked up a weight. So let's talk about it, bro. So why does mass move mass? I think is the key question.
Well,
scientifically speaking.
Newton's third law, every action will create an equal and opposite reaction. So if I am pushing against something, okay, my mass will go into that equation because my mass and the force that I can produce will go into the moving that mass and the acceleration of that mass. Okay. So, if you think about it, someone that's lighter is obviously not going to be able to, taking strength out of the equation, someone that is lighter is slightly at a different advantage when trying to produce as much force as possible, because they have less mass to help them move that force. It's not a linear relationship, but there is some relationship with muscle cross-sectional area and strength. So obviously the bigger the muscle, generally you are going to be stronger. However, this isn't a direct correlation. So there's a number of different things which also contribute to you being able to produce more force, which is obviously very beneficial for your strength metrics, which is key if you're a hybrid athlete, because you have strength metrics which you're trying to improve on. So mass is important, but mass is important from a negative perspective when it comes to the endurance training, because like you said, if you're going to carry that mass over 10K, every time you take a step, there's going to be a higher oxygen cost to each step. So it takes more energy to move that distance comparison to someone lighter. So yeah, all really, really important. It almost like links back, right, to the whole idea around the interference effect. It was really well explained to me years ago by Professor Keith Barr, and he used the hunter-gatherer example, where hunters in the Neanderthal age, they would travel huge distances to try and catch food, essentially, and they never really knew when the next meal would come. So they obviously needed a certain amount of muscle and strength there to be able to sprint, jump, throw, whatever it takes to catch the food. But a bigger muscle takes more energy to contract. So they don't want it too big, because they don't know when the next food is coming in, and they have to carry that mass over a long distance to hunt it. So the body becomes very much more efficient. It wants to be strong, but it also wants to be smaller because it's more efficient for muscle to contract that way. So that's where the idea of, a big component of the interference effect comes from, especially from a molecular sense, because the body wants to be efficient, and through hybrid training, you're trying to trick it to say, no, actually, we want that mass because we want to use it for something else, but also we'd like to, cover distances at speed. So that's the trick that you're trying to do through your hybrid training.
So for those listening that might be at this point thinking, okay, so why do you have 73 kilo lifters sumo deadlifting 320 kilos? Because they don't have as much mass, but they're lifting more than Big Bob from down the road that's 140 kilos and can't deadlift that much. So 2 questions on this one for clarity. Is the relationship between mass and force application similar for fat and for muscle, i.e. is all mass created equally in this equation? And then secondly, if you could just explain the sort of neurological elements and the conditioning elements that come with utilizing mass for force production.
Yeah, so obviously fat or additional mass coming from other parts, passive components of the body, don't have a contractile element. That's why it's a passive component, whereas a muscle is an active component. So you've got one part of you that is actively creating the force, and one part that's not. However, adding that additional part can help create an overall mass, which can help when it comes to the relationship with the mass you're trying to move. So I guess you can look at functional mass versus non-functional mass, however you want to frame it. However, if you think about it, like you said, someone sumo deadlifting is 73 kilos and can do it 3 times his weight. It's similar to Naim Solomonoglu, who was the first person to clean and jerk over 3 times his body weight. He was like 4'9". Like, he was one of the lighter lifters. Whereas if you think about the heavier lifters, they're bigger, but they're not hitting numbers that are like 3 times body weight. And that's because there is not a linear relationship between the two. And quite often, if you're trying to get a true, understand a true strength of the person, you wouldn't just normalize to body weight. There are a variety of different ways of trying to allometrically scale it so you can get a better idea of who's stronger, who's not. And I often think it back to, like, I was seeing a load of different weightlifters and seeing the different heights. Like, you can get like super heavyweights who are like 6'6". The amount of mass you need to put on at 6'6" for a weightlifter to almost like equal out where the mass distribution is throughout the body is huge. So you could argue they're not heavy enough, but there are physiological limits on what we can actually achieve. So that's one of the reasons why you kind of get this weird tipping point when it comes to, like, if you're using times body weight as a metric for like strength, you get those middle body weights who seem to be really strong, whereas you get to the super heavyweights, which are, let's say lifting 2.5 times body weight, whereas 3 times body weight for the low body weights. So it clearly is a relationship between functional mass and non-mass and the overall component of mass, but it's certainly not a linear relationship.
I think that example you gave with the big frame versus the small frame is something I paid a lot of attention to with my marathon prep last year. Unfortunately, it ended in a stress fracture, so I should have paid more attention, but nonetheless, we move on. But the key detail, and the thing that I was the problem I was really trying to solve was efficiency, because I am a body weight that is not generally attributable to my height when considered within the context of available running data. So what I mean by that is a lot of the running data available to us in a literature and scientific sense, a lot of which I'm sure you'll have seen, is based on runners and runners only. And obviously the more performance-driven that data gets, the more hyper-specific the individual is to the sport at play because of genetic predisposition, leverages being better placed for certain sports just by virtue of the way that they are, for example. So last year I kind of went in with the question of, right, I weigh 94 kilos at 5'11", 181 centimeters. The mileage prescriptions and considerations on volume and intensity and all the things that would be available to me in a literature sense would be accounting for my body weight being made up of me being 6'5", 6'6", generally speaking, not condensed with a higher muscle body volume. And key detail for me specifically, short femurs, which means that stride length is then reduced as well, that isn't made up for by the additional height. So I'm kind of doubling down on reduced stride length, increased transient impact load, but I started trying to place that within the context of the running data available to me. And then thought, okay, I need to look at this a little bit differently. I need to try and solve for the problem of efficiency accounting for that reduced stride length relative to height, relative to body weight. And this is where the conversation on mass moving mass in a strength setting versus mass moving mass in an endurance setting goes the other way, and is where finding that individual balance in a hybrid training setting is the sweet spot that I'd love everybody to be able to achieve, so that, as we've always said, you can be in a position where you're sort of 3 to 4 months away from pivoting in whatever direction you want to. For me, I found that to be about 92, 93 kilos as my nice pivot point. Anything above that, I'm a little bit more strength biased. Anything below that, I'm a little bit more endurance biased, but I haven't been below that for a long time. So all that's to say, if we look at this from the other side of the spectrum, then there's a lot of things that we need to consider there as well. And given this is a podcast for hybrid athletes, I think it's important to highlight that, yes, every single stride that you are outputting when running is coming with a higher transient impact load, which is going to be a higher cumulative fatigue. It's going to be more impact on the joints. It's going to be higher wear and tear on your shoes. It's going to be even more important for you to be conscious of your running technique in case you're overstriding and disguising that with big chunky trainers, for example. And actually why I'm an advocate for heavier runners getting comfortable with more minimalist shoes before they start wearing maximal cushion shoes, because you can't disguise inefficiencies in gait pattern. So there's a lot that I've covered off just there, but we'll bring it back in. So from your perspective, Phil, what are the key considerations for heavier athletes that are carrying a little bit more mass? What are the things at the front end they need to consider when it comes to endurance training volume?
First of all, I think most endurance training injuries come about because of an inappropriate spike or progression in training volume or intensity based on the condition they are at that point. So for heavier athletes, I would always recommend progressing them slightly slower than if I was working with an endurance athlete who's just doing some strength training to improve their endurance. Almost to the point where if I want to, I think you need to really work on some aerobic capabilities here, I'm going to look at non-impact versions to try and supplement that. Getting comfortable on a bike in the pool to the point where you're a strength athlete in triathlon. You know, you could argue that some of the off-season stuff that you're with a strength athlete and a runner may look quite triathlon-y because I want to get more volume in them, but I know that if I just do that with running, I'm going to spike it too much, and that could lead to an inappropriate accumulation of volume which they're not ready for. And that can manifest in a variety of different ways. So those are probably the two key themes. Is one, I progress slower, almost to the point where I would progress on the side of caution, and I would look at other options, non-impact versions, to supplement their training, because you know that's a great way of developing aerobic capacity, strength of the heart, a variety of different good metrics which you need to have as a runner.
If I was to do another marathon prep, best effort marathon prep, I would. I've learned a lot from the last one. I got into a really, really good position. I was really, really pleased with the progress made. But we did push it hard. We did push it right to the edge, and ultimately it didn't pay off. I think, truth be told, there were external factors like travel. I was taking the piss with my sleep a little bit and workload. And there's things I look back at and I'm like, you fucking idiot. And that's part of life. But essentially, I am someone that tries to stick to the plan as best as possible. But during my peak week, there was 2 nights in a row that I had less than 4 hours of sleep because of travel up and down from London and things. I'm like, maybe that intense session should have been an easy session that day. But anyway, we live and we learn. I will take the L, and I'm pleased upon reflection to have had the experience, because I experienced making a whole load of progress as a heavier athlete in a period of time that was predictable and manageable, and we achieved a lot of things that we wanted to achieve, in theory, on paper. Unfortunately, we overspilled at a certain point. You can't highlight exactly when that was, disappointingly. If anyone can come up with that solution, there's some money on the table. And all you can do is then reflect and look at what you do next. So if I was to do another best effort marathon prep, and this is something we do with a lot of our athletes that are training for marathons or half marathons at OMNIA that are a little bit more strength and sort of body mass biased, is how much can you leverage cross-training for aerobic development to leave the running specificity as intensity focused. And what I think downstream of this conversation is super interesting, and I'd love to hear your take on, is I predict that the next big breakthrough in S&C and endurance performance, and I'd love to see the research on this over the next couple of years, is that actually cross-training over a sustained period of time before specializing actually will lead to better performance outcomes in running primarily, but potentially things like triathlon as well. Because you look at Jimmy Whelan, coming from a road biking background and then running his first marathon in Valencia in like I can't remember exactly, like 2:08, 2:09. It was insane. And he credited, he made the point that nobody will have a bigger aerobic base there than he will. And he's right, because he spent 15, 20 years cycling on a road bike for however many kilometers a week. And then Alex Yee, who obviously very good marathon performance recently, but spent his whole life focusing on triathlon. But as you always say, Phil, the best athlete is the most sustainable one that goes the longest without injury. And if you look at Alex Yee, he's done so much volume across swimming, biking, and running for a long time. That means his overall running volume will have been lower versus someone that was only training for a marathon for that entire period of time. So if he builds and builds and builds and builds and builds and builds and manages to do that without any big bumps in the road, and then specializes into the marathon, there's clearly a performance on the table that is comparable to those that were just doing the marathon prep the whole time, but they will have been towing the line of injury versus setback much closer. And I think those principles, one, are very fascinating in terms of the next evolution of S&C and cross-training utilization for running performance, but also can be completely and directly attributed to training heavier athletes or hybrid athletes that are looking to balance both. So that's what's personally really exciting to me. Is that something you've paid much attention to? Because I think cross-training is going to be leveraged. I mean, it's not gone out of fashion. It's always been in fashion, of course, from a concurrent training research point of view. But I think it's going to become more and more in, quote unquote, than it has been considered recently.
In terms of youth training, it's very popular trying to train in a variety of different sports, learn lots of different skills, not specializing until at least like the minimum age of 16. So there's so many examples where, particularly I guess in our culture, where you've got people that have specialized way too early and they get to a point where they've completely burnt out or start getting recurring injuries when they've just made it to that elite stage. So in terms of youth athletes, there is a lot of that supporting it. What could happen is that we're seeing people continue cross-training until much later, maybe into their mid-20s, and then they go through that kind of selection process into other sports, and they've just got this huge training volume before them, and then all of a sudden they focus, they narrow down on a particular sport. That could potentially happen, because we are seeing examples of someone that didn't quite make it in a sport, then go to one of those selection days where they get tested in a variety of different ways, and they're like, oh, right, we'll select you to move to this sport. Yeah. So then they tailor all of these variables that they've trained over years, and then they specialize it later in a different sport. I think the guy that just won the skeleton for Britain in the Winter Olympics didn't specialize until much later. I think I know people who know him from where I'm originally from. So that idea of governing bodies going out and finding just generally great athletes and not going straight for the 16, 17-year-olds that show a lot of promise, actually goes to those that have developed a huge base already. And so, actually, you know what? You probably have a huge physical base that we can utilize, and you are probably mentally more mature than someone who's still a youth athlete. We can use that to then narrow it down towards elite performance in a particular sport. So I think that's what could happen. And I think it is, but it's not being documented as much, because the whole idea of not specialising early is well known and has been for years. However, are they going to then, move that late specialisation until the mid-20s and see a lot of people?
I'd love to see how intentional it becomes
winning.
In that if you've got the let's say you've got the marathon selection committee that highlights someone at 16 that looks to have a great limb length, leverage, and training history to be able to be an excellent marathon runner at some point. At what point, or could the research get to a point where they go, okay, let's make this person a triathlete for the next 5 years. They are going to compete as a triathlete. We acknowledge they are not going to be world class, potentially. They might end up being very good. And then, 3 years out from when we expect them to be a wonderful marathon runner, that's when we specialise. I'd love to know if anyone takes the risk on a long-term basis to sort of prioritise a different sport competitively, or a combination of sports where triathlon is obviously a multi-sport setting. Or you could say, right, the best thing that this 16-year-old could do for the next 5 years is decathlon. Then we make them an 800-metre runner. I would love to see, can you get an 800-metre runner to the same level or better with that sort of more intentional GPP, range-focused process ahead of the specialisation? Because I think what's cool about what we do with athletes as well is a lot of them come to us for fun. They're doing something new, they're doing something exciting, and they may discover that they don't enjoy it as much as they thought they would. And they might go back to their primary sport, which might be bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, whatever it might be. Or they might discover that, you know what, I'm at a point in my life where I feel like I've achieved everything I want to with the barbell, or I'm in as good a shape as I ever want to be. I'm quite happy just doing sort of 1 or 2 sessions a week to hold on to most of that. And then I'm going to become, I'm going to go all in on 100 miles. I think the Arc of Attrition is a dream race for me. I'd love to do it. And that's going to be my focus point. And they can adapt to the adjustment to that focus better because they've sort of balanced both things and then sort of specialised from that point onwards. So I think there's a lot of similarities, which is great. But I think that from a research point of view, I'm keen to see, is it going to happen intentionally or is it going to keep happening accidentally? From a hybrid training point of view, I think what's great is making enjoyment and fun your guiding principle when it comes to trying different sports is fantastic, but I think it's always important to remember that you are operating in a slightly compromised set of conditions, and that you should not view what the person on Reddit says as the minimum amount of mileage required for a sub 3 hour marathon, because that is based on the information of that person being typically built as a runner, for example, or not accounting for the fatigue of the strength training that they're doing separately. And I think that's where a little bit more trial and error and a little bit more openness to experimentation comes in, and being aware that with every step, there is a higher transient impact load. With every hill on the bike, you are outputting a higher wattage by virtue of you being heavier, which means there is a higher energy cost on that ride with more elevation. With swimming, there's things like actual functional limitations by having more muscle mass, making you a little bit more sort of functionally tight. And whilst that can be useful in some settings, you are maybe operating in a slightly shorter range of motion, which means that there's more technical work to be done versus someone who's a little bit more supple and can move a little bit better. There's all these things that go into it, but that is the puzzle and the fun that we're trying to solve. But I've been seeing more and more of this online, of people of the belief that there isn't a compromise with hybrid training. You just do everything really, really well. And that's not something that we like to encourage, because I think there is an element of compromise with everything, because you're allocating finite resources to more than one thing. I mean, that's just basic maths in my mind. And I think the best thing that any hybrid athlete, coach or athlete or otherwise can do is be aware of the limitations that come from additional body mass, from a nutrition point of view, from a physiological point of view, from an adaptation point of view, from a injury risk point of view. How do you leverage that for programming on this side, and then what are you cautious with to make sure that you're not just sort of running headfirst into a trap? Because mass does move mass in strength setting, but you require, if you're utilizing mass to move mass over a distance, then there's a few other things that you need to consider, as we've already flagged. So what do you believe, do you believe every athlete has a middle ground that makes them the most efficient version of the genetics that they were given in terms of limb length, leverage? I mean, obviously PhDs in biomechanics and S&C, so the selection pathway that you mentioned I'm very interested in. Do you believe, first of all, that each individual is predisposed to be better at one sport or the other? But in a hybrid athlete setting, can everybody develop themselves concurrently, even within those sort of genetic parameters?
I think everyone is genetically predisposed to be better at one thing than many other in terms of sports. However, I would say only a few are genetically predisposed to be very elite in that one sport. I think that in terms of hybrid training where it is at the moment, I think many people have the genetic ability to be pretty damn good in a variety of different sports. But again, we're not reaching the elite level. I think in the next few years, we're going to see certain athletes who are genetically predisposed to be very good at multiple things. So you've got elite in a single sport, and then you've got elite in the multiple sports. You could argue Matt Fraser, Tia Claire Toomey as examples from CrossFit. Whereas the majority of hybrid are weekend warriors, because I find it's a culture at the moment, who can still get very good in multiple disciplines. We just haven't fully seen or only had a glimmer of what very elite is in terms of combining everything. And we're going to see some of that, I think. People are chasing marathon in 2.5 hours and still high strength work, and I don't know where the elite is going to be, but it's exciting to see where that could come from, what combination we're going to see.
Agreed. I think it's all moving in the right direction, and I think like we've discussed in the past on the interesting part of CrossFit, where you've had CrossFit traditionally was a lot of athletes from different backgrounds that then specialised in CrossFit, whereas we are now seeing a generation of athletes that have only ever trained CrossFit coming through. So it's nice to see that comparison. We're probably not far off seeing a generation of athletes coming through that have only ever trained for strength and endurance concurrently, or maybe had a slightly more accelerated gym bro barbell phase before starting to run turkey trots and beyond, or whatever it might be. So that's what I'm excited to see, is because most traditional, quote unquote, hybrid athletes within Alex's original definition were strength athletes that were looking to go on a bit of an adventure. So they had that strength base that they were then layering on endurance. I think that gives you an advantage over doing it the other way around, because muscle tissue is difficult to build and requires a lot of patience and a lot of time. Not that endurance training doesn't, but muscle tissue isn't just inputted work, it's kind of the hypertrophy response that goes with more dialed in nutrition, all that side of things as well, which is more of a lifestyle commitment than it is a training commitment. And I think obviously the higher the endurance volume and the higher endurance volume needed to maintain an increase in fitness, the further up that curve you get, the more that's going to interact with and interfere with hypertrophy or allocation of training time, etc., etc. So what I'm super excited to see is what is the intersection of mass moving mass on a barbell or a stone or an Atlas stone or an Olympic lift, whatever it might be, that can also move at a disgustingly quick pace over a certain distance in whatever sport it may be. What is that sort of apex intersection of utter stupid humanity that I'm excited to see? Can somebody run a sub 220 marathon and, I don't know, deadlift 220 kilos? And I think that's that would be very interesting. That would be very interesting. And if anyone can do that, please do reach out, because we would like to send a film crew your way.
I don't think we're that far away from it. I think hybrid training have typically just tried to get good at strength and, I don't know, an endurance sport. But I think we're going to see people like, well, I'm pretty good at the deadlift, so I'm just going to do the deadlift.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty good at running, so I'm just going to do running. They're almost like going to specialize within hybrid training, do that over a few years, on top of years of just general training. We might really see how far this can go.
What I am starting to see, however, and this may ruffle a few feathers, is what I'm going to coin as the new evolution of the chicken leg bros. In that there's quite a lot of people that I'm seeing that are suddenly not doing any intense leg training or any sort of demanding strength work in their lower body because of their commitment to running, but they are over-indexing quite heavily on beach muscles and bench press, which I understand the logic as to why, because you're allocating fatigue accordingly. But the whole point of hybrid training is to balance opposing disciplines, and lower body fatigue from strength training versus lower body fatigue from trying to improve an endurance performance are those opposing disciplines. So am I concerned, or am I observant that there are more and more high volume runners avoiding hard effort lifting in their lower body? That seems to be the next evolution of the every day is chest day bra evolution, because I firmly believe, having experienced it, that lower body lifting is more challenging to balance than upper body lifting with high endurance output, because you're dealing with unpredictable levels of fatigue from one impacting the other, whereas linear progression on bench press alongside linear progression from a marathon performance, for example, is a little bit more predictable. So I'm not saying that there's some chicken leg bros out there, if they're running really quick, that's sick, obviously. But let's not forget that heavy squats and heavy deadlifts are still a thing. And that is a component of how strength is typically measured to the modern bro. That's all I'll say.
Well, I guess they're runners.
Well, yeah. Again, this is semantics now, but they're runners that like to be jacked. But I think, that's the key then. And this is where it gets interesting is, are we just seeing people are competent at lots of different things all at once? That's great. Does the term hybrid athlete actually really mean anything in this context anymore? Probably not. And do I really care? No, not at all. But I think heavy deadlifts are hard. Heavy squats are hard. There was a previous generation of people that had the piss taken out of them for avoiding it. Are we potentially falling into that trap again? Let me know in the comments down below. I think is the conversation I'm opening up there. Using
what is old is new.
Yeah, what's it? Yeah, everything's repackaged ultimately, isn't it? Every new company in the UK is just a company that was successful in the US 2 years prior. That tends to be the way the world goes, and it seems that we've gone full circle in many ways. So I am interested, which is not to say that being really strong in your upper body and really fast in any distance is not really cool, by the way. I'm just basically being entirely biased on the fact that my squat is comparably much better than my bench, so I'm trying to play to my strengths, really. Entirely. But yeah, train legs, bros. Let's not forget that they're there, and that a strength response does not come from 400-meter reps at the track. So if strength endurance is the goal, remember to train the strength part, is what I'll say, flippantly and perhaps controversially. Anyway, that is a discussion on how mass moves mass and some of the things that you need to consider when it comes to the mass that you carry whilst moving said mass over a certain distance. I would just remind everyone that we're all individual and we all have different ways of approaching this, so trial and error is key. If you're looking to go on a journey of trial and error to determine how best to get your genetic predisposition firing on all cylinders, then that's what we're here to do, and we'd love to be able to help. Beyond that, just make sure to be cautious with your progression, be considerate of the fact that you are trying to balance progress in opposing disciplines, so advice from powerlifters on lifting or bodybuilders on bodybuilding and runners on running only doesn't necessarily account for the impact of the fatigue from the opposing discipline, so you will need to make your own decisions on that as you go, but hopefully this podcast and other resources can help support you on that journey. Anything else to add, Phil?
Nothing from me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. And as always, I feel like I should go and bench press now. I feel like I should go bench press and run really fast, which I don't have the ability to do at the moment at all. I can only move in zone 1 or zone 2. If I even dip into zone 3, I think I'm going to have a heart attack. That's how I feel right now.
I think you should replace squats with bench press deliberately in your training this week, just to see how you feel.
Yeah, I wonder what the coefficient of how much better does your squat need to be than your bench before you're becoming a chicken leg bro. That's something I'd like to figure out. Just for a bit of fun. Because it used to be the case of you were made a mockery of, in a fun way, obviously, if your bench was anywhere near your squat. But I feel like we've gone back to that now because people have just stopped squatting and therefore disguising how much they can squat and doing the age-old question of, how much do you squat? I bench 315. Like, that wasn't my question. But I say that as someone that used to respond to, how much do you bench, bro, with how much I squat. So I guess we're all as bad as each other, aren't we? But no, I think I am going to go bench press, in fact. So yeah, I'll enjoy that and probably realise that with all the swimming volume I'm doing, I'm incredibly weak. And my best days are behind me. So I look forward to the good days ahead because you're all going to subscribe to the OMNIA Performance Podcast right now, aren't you? Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.